Are we ready to go, Sarada? Yes? Okay, welcome everyone to this workshop today. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Alex Jenkins. For those who don't know me, I'm the director of the WA Data Science Innovation Hub. We're based at Curtin University, and our remit is the uptake and awareness of data science and artificial intelligence in Western Australia. So this is an incredibly important topic. As you're all aware, artificial intelligence has really swept the world over the last 6 to 12 months. And so how we guide our governments in responding to it, I think is really important. And you've all been invited here today because you have something to say about this really important issue. And I must thank Sean and Sarada from Perth Machine Learning Group, and of course SJ Price from Stirling Rose and Ty as well. Thank you guys for bringing this together. The goal here is not to come to some agreement about what the regulations on AI should be, but rather to help you frame your thoughts and your positions on the technology in such a way that they are concise and coherent and formed in a way that's going to make sense to policy, people who make decisions about policy. I think that's really important. So I won't babble on too much. I would encourage you, if you don't know about WODSI, please come and check us out, check the website, and we're also running an AI conference on the 2nd and 3rd of August. We'd love to see you all there. But without further ado, I will hand over to SJ or to Sarada or Sean.
Sean or Sarada, yeah.
All right, thanks guys.
We don't. Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to do a quick blurb about PMLG because I'm not too sure how many of you are aware of Perth Machine Learning Group. And no. Keys.
Okay, that's not good.
No,
Maybe
it
it's
always
that.
works. Yeah.
No?
Okay. Technology. Don't you love it? Okay, yeah, so Perth Machine Learning Group, we've been around for 6 years, coming on to 7 years now. It's about 3,000 members in the group. We do a wide range of training. We've delivered about 24,000 hours of technical training in the AI space since 2017. We also do research and development, so we've done a lot of research in the medical space, in the digital pathology space, but also in the hardware space. We're focused now on hardware manufacture for not the next generation, but the generation beyond that of neuromorphic chips for AI. And this is all done in Perth. We also do research collaborations, so if you're interested in collaborating with us, feel free to reach out. And if you're interested in sponsoring the community generally, just ask for a sponsor pack. And so that's my little blurb. One more thing, for this event, we have put together a GitHub repo. So we're just kind of collecting ideas in here. This is not to steer anybody, but it's just to generate conversation around what's actually in the submission and ideas which people might want to consider. And we encourage you to share your ideas and drop them into that repo if you'd like to kind of participate in the wider discussion around like how we're managing AI generally. Okay, thank you. So I'll pass you back on to SJ.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming, because it's not normal that people will voluntarily turn up to do homework. So first of all, I just want to say I really, really appreciate it. This is a really important opportunity for us as humans, for us as Australians, and for us as West Australians, because the Australian government has called for submissions on safe and responsible AI and has in its questions set out some ways that the government may consider regulating. This is important because regulation of AI is not without impact. Regulation increases compliance burden, increases costs on organisations. It increases costs on government. If it's not undertaken in a balanced way, it can stifle innovation, and it can result in talented Australians seeking opportunities overseas. That's not something that we want for Australia. The best way to predict the future is to be involved in creating it. And that's why you're here today. We are all now involved in creating the future of AI. And by being involved in putting in a submission, you become part of the conversation. Your voice is heard. You make sure that the government knows thoughts that may be very diverse, ideas that are different and new, and in particular, the particular perspectives of those of us in Western Australia, particularly with our very vibrant resources industry. So I invite you all to take your packs there, because what we've tried to do today is we've tried to make you making a submission as low friction as possible. So we'd like you to take out your pens, grab that, write all over it, scribble over it, and so on. I just want to give you a few top tips about submissions. So first of all, you don't have to answer all the questions. There's 20 questions. Just choose the things that are relevant to you. So the things that are of particular interest to you. The second thing is, and this is something we do at Stirling Rose all the time, is we might answer one question, because that's an area we want to talk a lot about, that actually answers all the subsequent questions. And then we just say, see answer to question 2, see answer to question 2. So that's another way that you can do it. You can even just make a statement of your own if you want to, because these submissions will be read by the Australian government. Now, this is the Commonwealth Government's consultation. We know that the West Australian Government is planning to also undertake a consultation. And I'm imagining, without knowing, that the West Australian Government will also want to be putting a submission into the federal government, because the West Australian Government has particular areas of interest, as indeed we all do as Western Australians. So really want to encourage you today to take that pen, use this time we have together to move forward. And if you want to have a Word version of that document, absolutely just email me, absolutely happy to send that to you. There's 2 ways you can submit. One is you go online and there's a box that says make a submission, and you click that, and in you go, and it presents you each of the questions, and you just type in your answers. Alternatively, what you can do is you can create a document like this document in front of you, and you can upload that. At Stirling Rose, that's what we tend to do, because then we use those documents to put on our website and to share with our clients as part of our thought leadership. As organisations, you might want to do it in a Word document so you can share your submissions with your stakeholders and also with your employees. So these are the options. %82% of businesses believe that they practice safe and responsible AI. But less than 24% of them actually have concrete structures in place to enable safe and responsible AI. So the question is this perhaps one of the reasons why the Australian government is looking at regulation to try and move our country forward on safe and responsible AI? As Alex said, AI has tremendous opportunities for productivity, for new services, for new offerings to customers and clients, for making our society better, and for automating those boring tasks that we all have in our daily jobs. But with all opportunities, there are risks. And the challenge for us is to balance those risks appropriately to capture the opportunities. And that is also the challenge for the federal government. There are a number of risks involved in AI. And at Stirling Rose, we've created example risk registers to help our clients identify and manage the risks associated with artificial intelligence. There are also risks associated with potential legislation on artificial intelligence. So these are the emerging risks. And if you're wondering, the reason we have highlighted parts in our risk register is that we recently refreshed these to enable us to identify the new and novel risks associated with generative AI, following the release last November of ChatGPT and all the other generative models that we're using, like DALL-E and Midjourney. And in saying that, you'll notice that the artwork in our slide pack, it's all being generated by artificial intelligence, by Midjourney. Now, when you do your submission, it's important to know that as an organisation, you are going to be just a little bit schizophrenic because there are very different perspectives. And I actually got two hats to demonstrate this, because it's better to have two hats than to be two-faced, right? Okay, so some organisations are they're building their own AI in-house, right? Some are procuring them, and a lot of them are doing both, right? Because the truth is, we don't experience AI as AI. We experience AI as products and services in our daily lives that just happen to be enabled, fully or partially, by artificial intelligence. When you are in this build mode, you are more than likely wanting very light touch regulation. You don't want regulation that is going to increase your burden of compliance, take you more time, delay you getting your product to market, delay you implementing that amazing new digital twin. But when you are in the procure hat, your sense might be very, very different. For example, you might want the provider of your AI to tell you how much compute power is used in creating this AI and this product and this service, so that I can appropriately report my Scope 3 emissions. How was your training data annotated so I can appropriately report modern slavery? How did you trade off accuracy, transparency, explainability, and algorithmic fairness? Where did you get your training data from? Did you source it appropriately with the appropriate consents under the Privacy Act? Will you give me indemnification in case something that I do using your AI ends up getting me sued by someone? And on that point, it's interesting, Adobe has recently released an image generation algorithm, and they are offering to indemnify users. So they must be incredibly confident that they have all the intellectual property rights for their algorithm. Thinking about these two hats is incredibly important. And this is the area we are going to concentrate on today, because that is the most relevant to what you are doing in your organisations. But that's not the only areas of importance and interest when we're talking about regulating AI. It's also important to realise that when you are using AI on humans, on individuals, that brings with it a whole new raft of obligations and exposures. AI also has the potential to have business externalities and wider societal externalities. And AI is likely to be used by the government to make decisions about us. And although it wasn't AI, we've all seen the report on robo-debt, right? If you're talking about the expanse of impact, over 400,000 people wrongly chased for debts that were unlawful. And these, of course, are the most vulnerable people in our society. Wider society matters include this. So this is a picture of an explosion at the Pentagon. Not. It's a deep fake. But it went out on Twitter, and within release, the New York Stock Exchange, the stock market dropped 0.24%. So these sorts of things can really impact your business. Imagine it's your CEO, deep fake, talking about something to do with your organisation. And I just wanted to say, I love this deep fake of the Pope right in a puffer jacket. I just think it's quite gorgeous. So there are fun things as well. Let's start with myth busting. Tell me if you've heard this one. AI is not regulated in Australia. Have you heard that one? I hear it all the time. Well, AI is regulated, but it might not use the words AI. AI is regulated in the way that we, as humans, and organisations as legal persons are regulated. And by that what I mean is, if it's wrong for a human or a company to do that, it's pretty much certainly also wrong for an AI to do it. And let's have a look at some of the types of laws that apply to AI, even though you will not see AI in the legislation. So use of personal data, making sure you have people's consents, is the Privacy Act. And AI can absolutely breach the Privacy Act, and that is regulated because the company or the entity that uses it will be responsible. There are also cases of anti-discrimination where AI algorithms has discriminated against people on the basis of protected attributes. There's consumer legislation, and in fact Trivago was prosecuted for an algorithm that inadvertently, I'm hoping inadvertently, described hotel prices as being the best available price. That was misleading and deceptive, not by a human, but by an AI deployed by Trivago. And you'll also see these are very generic, or we call them horizontal laws, right? They apply across the whole spectrum. But there's also some very specific laws. For example, medical devices, therapeutic devices, and the use of medical devices or medical software. And also, there are things to do with autonomous vehicles, and most recently I know our government has actually aligned on some sort of framework regarding those matters. So regulation can be horizontal, where it covers everything, or it can be vertical. And this is one of the questions that is being asked in the submissions. What way do you think is better to regulate? Do you think it's better to have an AI Act that regulates horizontally across everything? Or is it better to grab the little places like medical devices and autonomous vehicles and just regulate for those? I'm not here to suggest what is the right answer, because the truth is, I don't have the data. You have the data from your organisations to know what is right and appropriate for your particular circumstances. I should say you will notice as we go through today, in little font, I actually have referred to the various questions on these slides, so that you will be able to see from the slides how they track to the questions that the government has asked in its call for submission. It wouldn't be a talk by a lawyer if we didn't talk about definitions, would it? I mean, lawyers are just obsessed with definitions. We're just obsessed. Curiously enough, I don't really have much legal stuff to say about this definition of artificial intelligence, but I do have a few comments as someone who's done some machine learning, thanks to Perth Machine Learning Group. And let me explain the two comments I need to make. So first of all, I look at artificial intelligence, and people don't agree on the definition. Let's just put that out there. But I'm reading this definition, and where it says, without explicit programming, I read that as being machine learning, not hard-coded, human-coded artificial intelligence or rule-based systems. The second thing I think is interesting about this is I question whether it is adequately future-proofed. I'm not saying it should be, but I question that, and there's two reasons I question it. One is varying levels of automation. I would expect that to say autonomy. And the second one is a set of human-defined objectives or parameters. I can absolutely foresee, and I'm sure it's already going on, machine learning algorithms creating their own machine learning algorithms, so that the objectives and the parameters are defined not by a human, but actually by a machine learning system. That is question 1 in the pack about whether you agree with those definitions. What a lawyer will say is, well, before I agree with the definition, what are you going to use it for? What are you going to use that definition for? And on that, things are pretty silent. But what I would say is if the government is asking you about this definition of artificial intelligence, this is what the government is planning to consider regulating. The key question for organisations is, in your organisation, are you using or doing something that would fall in that definition? Do you have digital twins? Are you using generative AI? And I can tell you from Stirling Rose's perspective, absolutely, we are doing things within our organisation that absolutely fits within that. So depending on the nature of the regulation, Stirling Rose could be regulated by any regulations that use that as a definition. Now, if you want to exclude things, you can have a big, wide definition of artificial intelligence, but your regulation could also list out things that are excluded or things that have lighter touch, for example. So that is question 1 on your submission pack. Whether you agree with those definitions, don't agree with those definitions, think it should be wider, think it should be narrower, think it should be future-proof, think it shouldn't. I'm going to pause for a moment there. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they would like to share? Or... Yeah.
Quick question, I guess, SJ. So, in your experience, have there been other transformative technologies in the last 5-10 years where governments have tried to regulate them but have been unsuccessful at doing so?
Yes.
One example might be CRISPR. Those of you who know what CRISPR is? Yes, so it's a way of editing genes in situ. And so there's a lot of self-regulation that goes on with CRISPR in particular. Although there was one scientist who claimed he had actually edited genes in situ with babies. So I'm just wondering if there are examples of recent transformative technologies that we might have forgotten about because they're now in our pockets or we don't even pick them up.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Listening to the Senate inquiries in the United States, I would say that the United States government is disappointed that it didn't appropriately regulate social media. And I think that explains a lot of the interest that they now have in artificial intelligence because they feel that they need to get this one right. But this is difficult. I think it's difficult. I'll be interested in your views as we, move on through this.
So just a very quick follow-up question then. So with social media, for example, and with defamation law, were the existing structures, legal structures in place, to, for example, handle the fact that if I post something on Facebook that might be defamatory, Facebook is not liable, whereas if I had written an article that was published by Australia.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's a very controversial section of the United States law. I think it's section 230 that enables platforms like Facebook to actually absolve themselves. Well, I'm not responsible for what's on my platform. So it's very controversial. And I think that is part of the sensitivity that the US government has to artificial intelligence. The other thing I think makes artificial intelligence a little different, and that is why I think these submissions are kind of conflated with automated decision making, is because of the scale and speed at which AI can make impact in a way that humans simply couldn't. And I know that robo-debt wasn't machine learning, but robo-debt gives you an example. I mean, I think at one point they were sending out, was it 10 or 20,000 notices per week to welfare recipients. So it's a very, very good question. Right, we are concentrating today on AI in your organisation from the two-hatted perspective, right? You building within your own organisation and you procuring within your organisation. I just want to, I've mapped here the questions into various parameters. So if later on, after this session, you want to make some comments about using AI in human-facing algorithms, these would be the questions you would go for. If you want to talk about government use that affects you, because remember AIs will be used to make decisions about your organisations, approvals, licenses and so on, these might be the sections you want to comment on. And then if you want to talk about wider societal impacts, these are the sections. But today, with the limited time we have, we're going to concentrate on these particular areas. So this is question 2, question 3, and question 4 in your submission. Are there gaps? We have laws that do regulate AI, even though they might not say AI. What do you see in your hats that is missing, that you would like to see regulated? And let me unpack this a little bit, particularly from the procure perspective. Some of the AIs we are using, even we are using in Stirling and Rose, are from such enormous companies that we have no chance of negotiating different terms. It's basically take the term or die. That's it. And yet maybe those terms are insufficient to enable us to comply with our legal and ethical obligations. Regulation might help us there. If it was regulated, or there was some standard that had to be complied with, that might help us, particularly in these very difficult negotiations with these large organisations. Things that particularly come to mind are ESG sensitive matters, Scope 3 emissions, modern slavery, consents for personal data use in machine learning. But there are many others. If there were standards that were mandated or requirements that were regulated, we would not, as little people, have to try and go and negotiate with these big organisations. Is that a gap? I'm not saying it is. That's for you to decide. But that might be one area that there's a gap. Has anyone else sort of thought deeply about this and identified a gap that they would like to share with us? Yes.
So, I don't understand this space that deeply, but I just wanted to kind of clarify something. To me, all this has come to light mainly because of generative AI, right? So to me, the gaps, the lens that I'm using is mainly from generative AI perspective, because a lot of you have been working in the machine learning data science space for yonks. It's only now where generative AI is being placed in the hands of society, in my opinion, in an irresponsible way, where questions around transparency, explainability, etc. have not been addressed. So to me, the entire focus of this is primarily from generative AI and around transparency and explainability. So I don't know if that
Fabulous. That is so helpful, because that's one of the questions. I think it's question, can someone find it, 17 or something, that actually asks you specifically about generative AI. And I think you're right, because the release of ChatGPT last year, it crossed some sort of threshold, right? It crossed some sort of threshold into published consciousness. Within a week, it had over 1 million users. It's now democratized artificial intelligence into people's hands, and in organizations, I think it's like 30% of people in organizations are using generative AI to increase their productivity and help them do their job. And of those, 62% are telling no one. So there's a lot of shadow AI use going on. So I think it's a great question, and I agree with you, and I think that's why it's one of the questions.
Do you mind if I just disagree slightly?
Yeah, absolutely, David. That's part of the fun of this.
I think it definitely has exploded into the public domain and has moved up the hype cycle with generative AI. I disagree with the fact that before it was all working well because it was held in the hands of professionals. I think there are countless cases of it being used in horrific manners, in recidivism in the US, in hiring, loans, insurance industries, countless others. It just wasn't so much held in the public domain because people didn't quite understand it. Now, GPT came out before ChatGPT, but what happened was that user interface, so how humans interact with it, became very easy and convenient. So it wasn't abstracted to technological people who could work with an API. It was just like, my parents can use, my grandma's used it quite successfully, and she finds it amazing. But I think that it has moved up the hype cycle, and therefore it's probably coming into the domain. But I would challenge that before it was fine. I think there were so many issues with how it was treated before, and I'm almost glad that it has moved that hype cycle, because now we are looking at potential regulation issues around that.
Sorry, I didn't mean it was fine.
Okay.
But it was confined,
Yes.
right? It was confined within an enterprise boundary of some sort. So if you're doing medical research, only your organization could influence or decide how to use that technology.
But we also saw, and this is something that I was before GPT quite concerned about, was the rise of auto AI systems from Microsoft, Google, Amazon. Does Amazon have them? I don't know. Essentially saying you could just put in your data, plug it and hit go, and you don't have that kind of critical lens to think about it and say, well, actually, is this biased? Is this wrong? And then it spits out a model that you can plug into your industry API and have automated decision making. And I think the discussion needs, in my personal opinion, needs to go beyond AI. And instead of in the discussion paper it says applications automated decision making, really we should be looking at automated decision making and AI being a subcategory. Because robo-debt is one of the biggest failures of government that costs lives and money. That should not happen. And the government's now coming out saying we should regulate AI. But really, that system should be interrogated and looked at. So I think it's broader in my personal opinion than AI.
So just as an observation, when you read through the consultation paper, the terms are very backward looking. They do reference generative AI, but they out of scope really is the whole context of IP, which is very interesting. But in context are automated decision making systems. And so really this goes back to the whole machine learning stack, and it refers really to your point about anything which is making an automated decision on behalf of people. So it does cover most of the systems which we use in everyday data science and in digital twins, as Shelley's referenced so far. So it's very much looking at what we are already using and questioning like how that should be regulated.
And David, just to flip back to question 1, given your comments, you might want a different definition, right? And you might want, you've already done it. Yeah, you're way ahead. You're way ahead. Okay, so the next question is, if you think there are gaps, how can they be filled? If they're not filled by regulation, how can they be filled with non-regulatory initiatives? And there are many things governments can do short of regulation that actually influence society and behaviour. For example, they can give gentle nudges or create principles, and we already have the 8 AI ethical principles for Australia. They can create standards. They can build with education and capability, which is actually really what we're doing a little bit now. We're building each other's education and capability. The truth is most policy and regulatory initiatives are a combination of both. It's a combination of regulatory and non-regulatory interventions. The question for you in submissions is, are there some of those non-regulatory initiatives that you think will be very valuable to our future in Australia? And one thing I should mention is, if we are moving towards AI, we're going to need some different skills, or we're going to need more STEM skills. We're going to need more people with these sorts of qualifications who are able to regulate AI, who are able to audit AI, who are able to understand AI. So harking right back to schools, this is the time that governments and civil society need to think about how we're going to plan to have the talent that we need for this 4th industrial revolution. That might be something that you might want to submit to government if you think it would be helpful for your organisation. And then question 4 asks about coordination, and this is important. We already have laws that touch AI. organisations don't want regulation duplicated. So they have to comply with the same thing or the same issue in 2 different laws. That does not benefit society, and it costs resources, time and money. So even within the Commonwealth, we want to avoid duplication. But there's another point. We also want to avoid duplication between Commonwealth and state. And that is why the coordination is incredibly important, not only for regulation, but also for other parts of services that government delivers. Being in Western Australia, we don't want all of the capability building and all of the education to be focused on the East Coast. We want that to happen here. We have a lot to give, and we want to get the knowledge and the capability that's necessary. So that is question 3 and question 4 in those submissions. So I want to pause there. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Yes.
So in the paper say that it does not seek to consider all issues related to AI, for example, implications of AI on the labour markets and skills. So when you give an example about the skills, like for example, implications about AI skills we might not have that to meet the demand of where we're going, do you think that it's still worth putting in there, or would they like not consider it at all? Like, because then
I do. Yeah.
I guess like we have less time to actually make a submission, and
Yeah.
I think it would be wise to actually make the most impact out.
I think so. I agree with you. If there is something you want to say, even if it's not responsive to the questions, I would say it. Because if more people say it, someone reads the submissions. It probably won't be in the report that comes out, but it will make some sort of impact, right? So I think Ivana's like, no, don't. But I think this is our opportunity. We have a portal. Someone has to read the submissions. And I do think, I know they say that about impact on the job market, but I do think in terms of capability building, which I think is one of the things they reference in the report, having a pipeline of talent I think is incredibly important, and manage to keep the talent that we have here, I think is also really, really important. Really good comment, and thank you for the insight.
Can never say short on time anymore. Just use a large language model and
Well,
get it to write you an answer.
Absolutely. You know, I have a philosophy about generative AI and large language models. They are perfect when generating content is time consuming or difficult, but verifying it or validating it is easy. So you can get ChatGPT to have a crack for you, and you'll validate whether it's saying what you actually want to say. But yeah, you can make submissions pretty quickly if you use a large language model. I'm loving it. If you think there are gaps, you know what the next question is, right? How are we going to regulate AI? And there are so many ways that can be done. I don't know if you've had the chance to look, but on the Stirling Rose webpage, we actually have a roadmap which talks about various different ways that people can regulate. And that may spark an idea for you, it may not. But it's very complicated in how you regulate AI. So let's just explore it a little bit, first of all, by looking at, well, what's happening somewhere else? Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's have a look at what's happening elsewhere. And on that, I think the preeminent focus of most people when they think about regulating AI is the EU AI Act. And on that, now for something completely different, I would like to invite my colleague Ty Haviland, who I have to tell you was a finalist in the top 30 lawyers under 30 in Australia recently, just to take us through just some of the headlines about the EU AI Act. Thanks, Ty.
Thank you, SJ. The big thing about the EU AI Act is it's the first horizontal legislation, meaning it covers everything to do with AI rather than specific harm-related outputs. So it does this through being a risk-based system. this risk-based system focuses on unacceptable, high, limited, and minimal risk. So the unacceptable risk that we would probably assume are the kind of dystopian things we don't want in society in the first place. These are things like biometric scraping data, scraping CCTV footage, things like social scoring, emotion recognition at border control, things like that. So the EU's outright banning them, and I don't think many people in this room would disagree that that's a bad decision. The next is high, and high is where most of the emphasis of the EU AI design. This is stuff like biometric data in general, law enforcement, management of law enforcement, management of critical infrastructure, things that can really affect the fundamental rights and remedies of a natural person in the European Union. So these requirements that you have to follow if you are developing a high-risk AI, piece of AI, and deploying it into the EU do differ depending on what the specific context is, but some particular ones involve, putting that into a European database, giving information around your risk mitigation strategies, things around your performance management of the AI, how much of there is a human in the loop, there has to be oversight, and even doing an impact assessment of that technology that you are developing, being an impact assessment on the health, safety, and natural rights of a person, how they actually might be affected by you deploying the AI. So, and the fines for these can range anywhere between 3 to 6% of annual turnover, or 30 to 60 million euros, depending on how large your company is. So when we say horizontal legislation, it's really to rein these in. And some of you might have seen Sam Altman and a couple of the other big players in the US talk about this response potentially, stifling innovation, and others still think that it encourages it for safe use. But this is our kind of first test as a society to see how regulation goes. Of course, there are still the limited risk and minimal risk ones here, which basically will remain unregulated going forward. These can be everything from spam filters to, an AI in a video game, an NPC character. You won't be seeing too much regulation slapped on them. But it's really around those two, the second category there. The one other thing on generative AI that was a bit of this has been drafted in 2019, and I think what's interesting about that is that the addition of generative AI and what we were discussing before, the sudden advent of that recently has actually caused some particular ones around the transparency obligations of things like ChatGPT. So that might even include things like providing summaries of your copyrighted data, how the data sets are being used. So things like ChatGPT being barred, the ones we see today, are actually going to be subject to these criteria, which we'll be seeing soon. So whilst this may seem, strict in one sense, there are certain points around it actually fundamentally protecting those kind of core rights as a human being that we're seeing a lot of reception from at the moment. So, thank you, Esther.
Thanks, Ty. To build on that, the generative AI requirements, oh, sorry, David?
Sorry, just a quick question. So, just trying to get across this in the last week or two, so
Yes.
quite fresh to it, but what is the general sentiment about its practical implementation? Or is it still considered a bit of a soft law approach?
So we should see how that, it's currently just been passed in its draft negotiation stage, so optimistically by the end of the year we should have that confirmed. By then, however, it's down to the actual EU member states to implement how hard they want this to be. This is a top-down European Union, so depending on how Germany, France decide that they want to really push certain things down, it's obviously not going to be consistent across, and that'll be on a country-by-country basis.
And I think we're going to see a lot of negotiation on what goes into high risk.
Sure.
Because high risk is where
I guess
the
that's the
obligations.
ambiguity question in terms of, it seems like there's a lot of really, really difficult calls that need to be made about
Very,
that.
very. And it's a fine line, right? What if you're on the border of high risk and not high risk? Yeah. It's a very good question. The EU AI Act. Oh, sorry, sure.
So, in the unacceptable risk category, most of the unacceptable risks seem to be government.
They are, yeah.
Like risks of government to the populace.
Yeah.
Does regulation work for that sort of problem? It's like fox looking after the chicken.
Yeah, if they can just shut down their own laws, say.
Well, that's one of the wonderful things about democracy and constitutions, right? Because a lot of the time it does work. It's worked in Australia since 1901. But you're quite right, because if not government, then who? I think it wasn't it Winston Churchill or someone said that democracy is the worst type of government except for all the others. To your point about generative AI, the EU has actually made some special rules about generative AI. And looking at the hats again, if you're in the procure mode for generative AI, you might actually like those requirements for generative AI, right? To do a fundamental impact assessment on fundamental human rights, to make sure that it has guardrails to stop the generative AI from breaching the law and so on. Because you don't have to negotiate that in your negotiations with OpenAI, which you wouldn't be able to negotiate in any event. So I think this is very interesting regulation. The other thing about the EU is this law going to become the de facto world law in the way that the GDPR is? They call it the Brussels effect. And the other thing I want to ask but not answer is this going to make the EU a leader in AI regulation, or is it going to make the EU a leader in responsible AI use? And they might be different things.
SJ?
Yes.
I've been on a few of the European panels and the UK panels who are trying to adopt the UK, that sort of chatting with each other. There's a lot of discussion about a thing called the good work algorithm impact assessment that they're using to as the way to determine the risk level. So it generates a risk assessment of its own right, which goes against that pyramid framework thingy. So that's by the Institute for the Future of Work. I don't know where they're from, but it's a reasonably decent model. But yeah, good work algorithmic impact assessment. And is all framed on this like good work charter. It's specifically for the work context, which is what I'm looking at it as, you know. But it's a good and interesting approach if anyone's interested in looking at that.
That's really helpful. Thanks a lot for Cameron. By the way, Cameron is doing 3 submissions.
Only
So,
2 now.
oh, only 2.
They're too closely aligned now.
Thanks, Cameron. Yes.
Sorry, just a very quick question.
No, not at all.
So you've looked at the EU, what the EU is doing. I understand that the Biden administration has come up with an AI Bill of Rights. I'm just wondering whether anybody has looked at the two to see what the differences are between the US so-called Bill of Rights and
a very American.
Here's something
title,
we actually have got a backup slide on the US bill. It's not really a bill of AI rights. It's like our principles. But it's principle based. I'll see if I can find it. I don't know if you have anything to add.
So it's 5 major principles there, particularly around opting out. It follows a similar kind of thing around fundamental rights of the person. So everything around someone being able to basically tap out of being utilised by an AI system, what kind of data is being fed into it. Your right to disconnect is a big one on there. It's very touch and go with Silicon Valley, obviously being home there to where they're developing and deploying this stuff. That the US Chamber of Commerce, I forget his name, said recently that the US isn't anti-regulation, but they want smart regulation. They're really taking their time with this to not have any kind of knee-jerk response and shut down the epicenter of where this competition is being moved.
They've devolved their federal responsibility into federal agencies. So depending on the use case, same agency is supposedly making a decision. So say if you're in the medical research versus some other, the medical research body, the federal agency is supposed to be coming up with their own definition of regulation. And the maturity between the 5 or 6 agencies responsible for all these is just all over the place. It's all over the place. So they're lagging far behind EU, in my opinion, in what I read. So
The question in the submissions is, do you like any of the regulatory analogues from other places? Do you like the EU AI Act? Is that something you think is appropriate and adaptable to Australia? Now, the EU Act has similarities in other places. So Canada has also got a bill that is risk-based, where it categorises AI into particular risk categories and regulates it appropriate to the risk. Also New Zealand, they actually have a categorisation of algorithms that are used for government decision making, and there are 3 categories with different requirements. So the vision here with this risk base is to actually figure out what the risk is and then to appropriately regulate at that risk. So it's not a one size fits all. The US AI Bill of Rights is really just principles like we have in Australia. There's also specific legislation. So in the US, for example, in New York, they have a law that prohibits the use of machine learning in hiring. So in deciding who gets called in for a job or not. So they have some specific narrow areas that are specifically legislated. So what do you like? Do you like what's going on in the EU, Canada and New Zealand? Do you prefer that principles approach from the US? And now let's briefly talk about Singapore. I think Singapore is quite interesting. And I think the Singapore approach is probably reflective of the fact that Singapore is small, but it realises that it is a price taker rather than a price maker. So what it has done is it's created principles and also a really interesting technique to enable companies to analyse the fairness of their AIs, and it's called AI Verify, which I think is a really interesting position to be in. Their vision is they're going to watch what's going on in regulation in larger countries, and because they haven't regulated but it's principle based, they are able to pivot very quickly as things change. And there's one thing that we certainly know in AI, things are going to change. Like transformers, I remember when I started becoming involved in machine learning, remember it was RNNs, and then suddenly transformers was all the, I mean, what is going to be next? Someone is working on something else, something new and amazing. So there we have question 5. Do you like any of those? Do you think those are applicable to Australia? Now let's talk a little bit about generic solutions or specific solutions. So the specific solutions are you regulate medical devices, you regulate autonomous cars, you regulate hiring algorithms. That's one way to do it. Generic opportunities are really like we have in the Privacy Act. They apply across all sectors. Anywhere you're using personal identifying information, doesn't matter what sector you're in, doesn't matter what you're doing, you will be caught. And that is what the EU has done with the EU AI Act. It applies to artificial intelligence wherever you find it, whatever sector, whatever application. Do you have a preference for how you think the government should regulate? Should it be generic or should it be specific to particular use cases? Cameron.
Yes, Jeff, the more I hear you say this and read about this, the more I coming to the conclusion that it's not so much how, but who.
Who regulates or who is regulated?
Who is going to regulate? Because
yes.
that's not being proposed, and it's certainly not clear.
Yes.
Because who regulates or who is considered a competent regulator under the given, the government has suggested someone, or is it going to be existing regulation based on AI gets integrated into existing regulation, and therefore the who is already answered. It feels, because they're not asking that question, that they already have an answer. So that to me is an interesting question, is to go, well, if we're going to regulate AI in specifics or like medical devices, then we already have a medical device regulator, and therefore they'll take ownership of that. But that means that all departments and all areas of government are going to have competency about regulating AI, which doesn't make any sense.
That's right.
Well, it makes some sense, but it makes it a very difficult thing. So
it does.
I wonder whether or not that question is an appropriate counterpoint into this, as to going, well, it's all well and good about like how and what, but who's going to do it?
It's exactly right. And you would have heard in the US Senate hearings that Sam Altman was suggesting that there be a new regulator established to do this. with the level of expertise. I look at that and think, how is the government going to pay for that level of expertise when you have Google and OpenAI paying huge salaries?
Well, they'll only regulate high-risk activities, therefore they're hardly regulating anything, therefore it's upward.
Well, that's another way to look at it too, yeah,
But
exactly.
the concern I have with this is that AI is a tool and it's being used within a vast range of domains, and you regulate for a domain, and you can't regulate generally if you don't understand the specific domain. So you can't have both AI domain expertise, kind of AI expertise and like specific domain expertise in the same regulatory agency. We don't have that capability. So it doesn't seem practical to implement like some centralized thing which is spread across everyone. And the reason why I say that is because you may do something which is risky in terms of when looked at in one sphere, but in your sphere that's actually saving lives.
Yeah.
But it may not save all lives. It may actually have like a off-target effect which does kill people, but overall you're saving lives. And the example I gave like last week for this was once again the ABS thing. In most conditions that saves lives. In some extreme conditions it actually costs lives. But we accept that that's a safe system. We accept that it's fully, it's accepted by the regulator. We don't question it. But if you were looking at it from maybe just the domain of AI, you would say, no, that's an unacceptable risk because you don't understand the wider context.
Vision is maybe what the EU is doing, is they're trying to abstract something at a certain level and allow for local tailoring. And so isn't that really where you get the benefits of both? You get a consensus theme across your locals, but you've got sufficient local expertise to help you with that tailoring.
Yeah. And I think a lot of what's going to happen with the EU AI Act is a lot of the really hard decisions have been pushed off to creation of standards. So there's a lot to run with this, and that's where a lot of the detail's going to be.
Also, what I like about the dissemination of that to localized standards, and that is it gives you a degree of redundancy, because if it's all concentrated in one area of decision making, I think that's a significant risk of failure for us as a global species, really.
Really good insights. Trent?
Yes, I tend to agree. Probably not binary, but potentially a mixture. If you look at the international accounting standards, you look at the international sustainability standards, I mean, there's 48 volumes of international guidance for then the locals to look at the interpretation of that. And so I think a model like that seems to make more sense to me. And it seems to be the way the world likes to gravitate toward it in those sort of global standard bodies.
Yeah. And we're becoming increasingly globalised. And that's another impact of the EU AI Act. If you are an organisation that wants to deploy your artificial intelligence in the EU or on EU citizens, you're going to have to comply with that. You are caught by the extraterritoriality of it, which is why global standards, I think that's one of the reasons that people are gravitating to it, because it enables us to engage in trade.
One of the boards I'm involved with is the packaging covenant regulating packaging and its impact on landfill. And there's going to be an Australian standard dicking around with packaging. Meanwhile, the global heavyweights that are here having a higher barter chin. They're going for the international standard, Coke, Mars, Nestle, because that's where the ethical investors will insist they be.
Yeah, and that's actually a really important insight, because we can legislate in Australia, but if your organisation is implementing AI in the EU, you're going to have to comply with the Australian law and the EU law. And so talking about duplication between Commonwealth laws and between Commonwealth and state laws, there's also the potential for duplication and double compliance with Australian laws and with laws that have extraterritorial effect. It's a complicated world.
Do you have some ideas on what AI should be banned completely? And Ty told us about some of the ones that have been banned in the EU. As an organisation, are there some things that you don't want to happen? So yeah, that's an interesting thought for you to think about. That is question 10. I like this, not because I know it's too small for you to read, but I like it just as a picture of what's going on. So the square red ones are international and the blue circles are Australia. I think it's really interesting to see that in this area of law and regulation, look at the top. The top is the stuff that is AI specific. Everything else is either economy-wide or application-specific. So in talking about do we regulate horizontally for AI or do we regulate for tech-specific applications, that is a really good picture of what's going on. And then we can also see there is a lot of voluntary principles, government policies and standards, and also a number of things that are applying to government itself, such as the one in New Zealand that I mentioned. So it's too small to read, but as a pictorial of where we are, I think that's valuable. That's actually in the discussion paper if you want to take a closer look at it. Here's a few other questions to think about in regulating AI or regulating anything. Regulation can either be preventative or remedial. The EU Act is preventative. It requires organisations to do things to prevent harm happening, in advance of any harm happening. And generally preventative legislation is seen as being appropriate when negative impacts cannot be fixed or are permanent or lasting. For example, medical devices, robo-surgery. If that goes wrong, that may well be very bad impact, permanent, irreversible. Remedial laws don't put a lot of compliance burden up front. You don't have to prove that you did this or that. You don't have to get a certificate, but if you breach it, then you will be prosecuted, you'll have to pay a fine, or you may have to pay compensation. So there are two different data points about how we regulate, or how we can regulate. The other thing about AI regulation is, do you want to regulate everyone the same? Because it's easy for the giant corporations who have massive budgets to employ legions of lawyers to create all of the compliance documentation that's required and get all the approvals. If it's me in my garage building a dogs and cats computer recognition algorithm, I don't have any of that stuff. Do you want to regulate me the same as you regulate them? The other thing is, if you regulate me very harshly, you may stifle innovation, because I simply cannot discharge that compliance burden, and I might get on a plane and go off somewhere else. It may be that appropriate AI regulation looks at certain entities below a threshold are not regulated, or certain types of things are simply not regulated. It may be that you look, and this is generative AI, it may be that if you have an AI system that has a very broad user base, you are absolutely subject to those obligations. These are very... does anyone here want to be a regulator now, having heard this? Anyone up for that job? It's a tough gig. It's a very tough gig. Tech gods are not shining on you. I'm going backwards now. And of course, when you regulate, you need to have the mechanisms to do it. So here's just a menu for you If you want to regulate, you might require licensing or certification or those sorts of things. Or if you want non-regulatory mechanisms, there you have them. So you can choose this. And these are some of the questions you'll see if you want to talk about banning. That's question 10 and question 12. If you want to talk about risk impact assessments like the EU Act, that's 14 to 20. And if you want to talk about non-regulatory mechanisms, you can talk about those and make your submission in question 3. We also, I've spoken to you about the submission roadmap that you can have a look at on our webpage. We've talked about the risk-based approach, which is what Ty talked about when he talked about the EU AI Act. In Australia, in the discussion paper, it actually sets out these categories of risk: low risk, medium risk, and high risk in the paper. So the government's already really thinking about having a risk base, and it's actually described certain things that would fit into those categories. The fact that the government has dedicated 6 of its 20 questions to risk-based approaches probably tells us something, right? It tells us that they are thinking that way. Now, the question for you in your submissions is that a good thing? Is that the thing that makes sense from your organisation's perspective? Procuring AI. I'm feeling a bit thirsty. If I want a drink of water, which one do you think I would prefer to drink out of? Which one? This one or this one? Why?
Transparency.
It's transparent, right? And if you are in a world of procure, that is something you may very well want, and you might want it regulated or legislated. It's very important that people trust systems and water bottles that are transparent, because they can see and understand how the system has been created, how the system is being used, and how the system is interacting with them. Yes?
Actually, did anyone else think blue one? Was it just me?
That's got Ginny.
Yeah.
Usability.
Usability, yeah. Less of friction. That's what I thought. It's really interesting because this is, in terms of transparency, a lot of my background formerly in architecture is around design and design affordances. Like designing systems and interactions that enable you to work in a certain way. And I think this is when a lot of my kind of thoughts around transparency, I don't want to jump ahead if we're talking about, is transparent for whom?
Absolutely right.
And I think when we talk about GPT blowing up, it's about that user interface and how we connect with it. And then if we look holistically at the pipeline of data science, where are you talking about transparency? You're just talking model transparency? You're talking data sets, data, procurement, everything all the way through, even down to application.
Exactly. And that is one of the questions. One of the questions for the submissions is, at what point in the AI life cycle is transparency most important? Let me just go there. I'm just going to take this. Okay. So you can see down the bottom there the AI life cycle. So these submissions are asking, are you asking for transparency in the acquisition of the data, or in the collection or the storage or the use and so on? So I think that's absolutely right. When and who to whom? The overwhelming majority of the information is saying that we are likely to be regulated to provide transparency to users as to when they are interacting with an AI. But that's at the final end, right? There is all these other things where we need transparency to enable us to comply with our legal and our ethical obligations about where did the data come from,
Has it been ethically and legally sourced? Have we made the right ethical and legal decisions about algorithmic fairness and accuracy and trade-offs between explainability and these other matters? So this is one of the questions. That's question 9 about the life cycle. I'm just going to flip back because I do want to talk just briefly. So transparency is really important because people are using ChatGPT in your organisation. Whether you know it or not, it's happening. It is happening, right? And a number of organisations have actually created their own policies to help guide their employees as to how you can use it and what things to be alert for. Now, things are going to change soon. Who's got O365? Yeah, okay. Have you seen Copilot? I know everyone at Oricon's seen Copilot because we had a look at it together. This is going to be a system that's like having ChatGPT, capable of looking at your own data within your own organisation and creating reports, creating submissions, creating slide packs, analysing data, analysing sales. This is going to be absolutely huge. You might want, as a procurer of Copilot, to have some sort of regulation or requirements to enable you to get the data that you need to comply with your legal obligations. Okay, top tips. You don't have to answer every question. Answer the questions that are relevant and important to you. Decide whether you want your submission to be public, so it identifies you and it's available publicly. You can also have your submission public but keep your identity anonymous, or you can keep everything private. You can keep your submission is private. The government will see it, but they won't refer to it in their ultimate report. They'll read it, they'll take it into account, but you won't be referred to. You have 11 days left to do this. This is absolutely the opportunity to make a difference. So we talked about the repo. I want to finish by saying education and governance are key. Whether we get regulated, how we get regulated, it's all about education and governance. And you'll see there, I've got a quote there about leaders who understand the technology and are ethically aware are going to capture these opportunities and they are going to future-proof their organisation. And as a little bit of a taster, you'll see there's a QR code there. If you want to take a 5-question pulse check of your organisation's readiness for generative AI, please feel free to do that. It's 5 questions. We're not asking for any identifying information. We've even toggled off your IP address. But if you don't believe us and you don't trust us, then just put bogus information in, and it gives you a little bit of a rating on a scale. Just the key is when you see the questions are all about education and governance. And finally, the best way to predict the future is to be involved in creating it. And I want to thank you all so very much today for being involved in creating a future of safe and responsible AI. Thank you, everyone.